Take my job, take my books, tell me I ain't coming back. I don't care, I'm still free, you can't take the library from me. Talk to the patrons, we're going black, tell them I ain't coming back. Burn the books and hide the keys, you can't take the library from me.
Hello, and welcome to the Page 49 podcast. I am your host, Montgomery, the librarian with a library and a degree. I want to welcome you to my second podcast that I'm actually producing. The first one is called The Monster Sci-Fi Show, in which my co-host and I, Mr. Gene, talk about all things science fiction and geeky and nerdy stuff that I love to do. But with this podcast, Page 49, I'm using a different tone and a different direction. I wanted to showcase the library as a resource or as a jump-off point to discuss current topics. So basically, I wanted to show that there is value in preserving information via a podcast. And I also want to analyze various works of literature and media content and kind of mash it together and see how it works. So basically, I just want to promote the library in this new format, which I'm hoping that I can demonstrate that there is value in which we can capture information from the people that work at the library and eventually from the actual patrons of the libraries and save that information for future use.
Here is my disclaimer. The opinions and ideas presented in this podcast are those of the author alone and do not reflect the official policy or the position of the Miami-Dade Public Library System. So there you have it. It's my first disclaimer. Let's get started. So for the first segment, I'm going to be talking about the Sony picture hack that happened before Thanksgiving. Now, being that this is the first movie studio that did get hacked, hacking for 2014 and 2013 wasn't all that different from the news that we've heard before. The difference here is that Sony Pictures had a movie that was coming out in the holidays for Christmas called The Interview with Seth Rogen and James Franco. Now, the hackers who were responsible for this action were referring to themselves as the Guardians of Peace, or the GOP, which we found out did have some ties to North Korea, or at least it was traced back to North Korea as far as the hack scandal is involved. But the GOP had threatened Sony that if this movie, The Interview, was going to be released in the theaters, that we should expect 9/11 style violence or actions as a consequence to showing this movie. So many theaters, of course, boycotted. Sony said, no worries, we'll go ahead and still show it anyway. But then the next day, Sony then caved in. But later, due to a big push from the public, did release the movie in limited release in theaters as well as online, and did pretty decent amount of money considering what it went through. And we did not experience anything of a 9/11 type retaliatory action from anyone. But I will talk about the movie in a little more detail in segment 2. But what I really want to talk about is during this whole fallout with the Interview movie, there was a movie that was going to be made by Paramount Studios that was based on a graphic novel called Pyongyang, and this is by Guy Delisle. Now, Pyongyang basically is the capital of North Korea, and since North Korea had a problem with The Interview, with Sony Pictures, Paramount decided to pull the plug. Unfortunately, it would have been an interesting movie to see because it would have starred Steve Carell, and the director is Gore Verbinski, who has directed many of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Now, I do want to talk about this book because this is what led me into other topics I'm going to bring out in just a moment. But basically, when we look at Guy and see his drawings of what he thought about North Korea, it's basically a stranger in a strange land. There's lots of weird things that are going on that don't make sense to us being as outsiders, but because of his situation of overseeing a French animation production company, he's allowed into North Korea, and he shows us this world that really is strange at times. So one of the things is that he does have a translator going with him wherever he goes. No one is out basically at night. There's a lack of light at night as well. I mean, literally, if you look at satellite photographs and over that region of the world at night, there's very little, if any, light showing in that whole region. It's really incredible. He had also talked about this tall, kind of like pyramid structure that appeared to be still under construction, but what it is that this is a hotel with 105 floors. It has 5 revolving restaurants, and 37 is supposed to be a 3,700 room hotel that was built back in 1998. And this is what for the Olympic trials. And it's not even done. But it's still being considered under construction. So it's kind of weird that they're putting on this face, but for who? That's the weird part. Now, one of the guy's frustration that we see is that he sees tons of propaganda everywhere. From billboard signs to graffiti on the sides of a mountain. Even the people themselves wear these little pins of their leaders on their clothes. So you can see the frustration. It's like there's no free thought, considering he's an outsider and he's maybe trying to influence some, like his guide to read the 1984 novel that he was able to smuggle in, considering how it has some kind of parallel action with Big Brother overseeing everything in North Korea, but he didn't care for it. The only thing that was kind of interesting was throughout the book, being that guy's in his hotel, he has this thing about folding up paper airplanes and throwing them out the hotel window and trying to make them land into the nearby river. And he doesn't get there throughout most of the book, except for the last part, which we're kind of hoping that he does. And to me, it was just maybe like an act of defiance, his own personal freedom, that he's able to do this one little act because he's in his hotel room and doesn't have the guide with him. So it was interesting to see that. But what got to me and leads me to this next topic is he briefly drew a couple of panels about the Korean War. And to be honest, I have no idea about North Korea, let alone Korea in general. I mean, all I know, and I'm sure many Americans will know, that after 9/11, George Bush had called North Korea part of the axis of evil. So they were and are our enemy, as far as we were told. Even in Team America, Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, was portrayed in this movie as being the bad guy. So honestly, that's all I know. And even to boot, what I know about the Korean War is basically what I've watching MASH, which, lasted longer than the actual war itself. So what I like to do is use sci-fi metaphors, basically, to kind of make this point across. And the point I'm going to bring up is Darth Vader. We meet Darth Vader for the very first time in Episode 4, A New Hope. And when we see him make his grand appearance, it's pretty menacing. Coming through the clouds, dressed in black, he's a really bad guy. And we know he's the bad guy throughout the rest of the other 2 sequels. Well, Darth Vader wasn't always Darth Vader. There is a backstory. And despite the fact that the sequels were not that great, we do see this rise of Anakin Skywalker slowly being turned into the dark side of the Force and later becoming Darth Vader. So we get a sense of who that person was before he became this great menace to the rebellion. Well, with Korea later becoming North Korea and South Korea, how did this all happen? So I did some research. Now, back in the 1930s, the late 1930s, Korea was occupied by Japan. To make matters worse, the Koreans were not allowed to use their language, their literature, and their culture, period. It was just banned, period. The Koreans were not allowed to have any identity, basically, of themselves. Move into World War II, we know that Japan is mounting an attack. So we have Russia coming out to help because they're part of the Allies and occupying the north part of Korea. And then we have the Americans coming in, occupying the south part of Korea. Now, where the two groups meet, that's referred to as the 38th parallel, and that's where, as a result of what happens afterwards, remains still the same. So, of course, the Japanese were defeated. The Americans and the Russians did leave after some time because they were also an occupying force, and the Koreans didn't want any part of it, but eventually they did leave. The reason why the Korean War happened, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, wanted to unify all of Korea. Now, being that Kim Il-sung is part of the Communist Party, and he was going to reunify all of Korea, the Americans did not want the spread of communism. So they went to war. So from 1950 to 1953, that was what the Korean War was about. So that whole 38th parallel line that kept going back and forth, Koreans got land, they lost land. So South Koreans gained land and they lost land. But in the end of the day, it became the exact same 38th parallel line as it started off with before the war. So it basically was a no-win for anybody. Except that North Korea decided, we're going to border up and protect ourselves from everybody else. South Korea is going to go ahead and stay aside and be more democratic. And that's where we got the two separation from Korea itself. Now, what's interesting is that now that we know this backstory, does your view of North Korea change, knowing what you know? I'm not saying that they're 100% in the clear, in which they have every right to be what they are. There are some atrocities they have committed. But once we understand their background, we kind of do get a sense of how they became that way. So, in the next segment, I'm going to be talking about the actual movie of the interview and how it kind of relates to what's going on with the Pyongyang graphic novel in some sense. So, I'll be back in just a moment.
You are entering into the most dangerous country on Earth. Kim Jong-un's people believe anything he tells them, including that he can speak to dolphins or he doesn't urinate and defecate.
Oh. You telling me my man doesn't pee or poo?
Everybody pees and poos. Where would he go otherwise? He'd explode.
But he does talk to dolphins.
So yes, James Franco, Kim Jong-un does talk to dolphins, which is one of the funnier scenes amongst many other parts of the interview that I enjoyed tremendously. I didn't expect to like it, but it was a lot of fun, especially for these two actors, which I liked and watched for many years. They were basically a lot of fun to see them play off each other. And basically, the whole assassination part of Kim Jong-un is not so much the highlight as it is just getting to that point in which he finally gets his just desserts. But what was interesting about it is that sometimes we see the lack of information or clarity we have about who the enemy is, which I talked about earlier. So in one part of the movie, James Franco had talked to one of the guards, a female guard, Sook, I think. Not a guard, but one of the people there. And he talked about that Kim Jong-un has to die. It's the American way. And she's basically saying, how many times are you going to keep repeating the same mistake over and over again? And his response is, as many as it takes. And that's probably true for the most part, is that sometimes we still repeat the exact same mistakes over and over again because for whatever political or financial interest we have in some territory that's not here in the U.S., we somehow have to get involved in that process. And then when we figure out what it is we want and how we're going to get it, down the road it somehow comes back and bites us in the butt, basically. But that's also what it ties into with the graphic novel, because when I look at Guy's response, he's not really pointing out people's flaws, but sometimes he's not really aware of what it is, what's the significance of some things. Like, for example, the Tower of Chuchi, in which Kim Jong-un had bestowed his father. This tower made out of a couple of thousand bricks, each one representing the number of days he had been alive in this construction of this tower. And on a one part, if you look at it from Guy's perspective, it's kind of extravagant for someone to do this kind of thing for his father. But knowing the significance of it, it means something to the people. And not to say that it's a bad thing. It's sometimes maybe a little too self-centered, egocentric. But do we not have monuments here ourselves, carved on the side of a mountain? Or we build large granite statues inside a much larger structure? Do we not have political officials wearing the American pin on their lapels of their jackets? So, just because we are not them, the enemy, and vice versa, we still have a lot of commonality, and I think sometimes people don't realize that just because we're told such is not always the case. Now, I think that the biggest problem of the interview might have been its greatest point to come across, mainly the assassination of Kim Jong-un. If Seth Rogen had not decided to name the dictator Kim Jong-un in the movie as such, that he was going to be assassinated, I don't think this movie would have been such a big deal. It played better with the fact that, yes, it is Kim Jong-un, and it plays into some of the people's ignorance because, honestly, if he's the bad guy, and you don't know a whole lot about North Korea or what they went through, then yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, let's kill the bastard. Why not? That's the enemy, and why not throw other people under the bus? Like, the next interview movie will be with Putin, or some other ridiculous leader that we don't like, because people don't really see the full story because they either don't know or they just lack information. But another point to consider was that, and Seth pointed this out in an interview, which was really interesting, was that because this movie was being made and Kim Jong-un was named in the movie, that somehow this movie itself would be smuggled into North Korea and the people themselves would see this. Now, yes, there was a threat to us about the release of this movie, but the bigger concern is that this was going to be the undoing of the North Korean government. That, I think, was the bigger scare. Not so much at us, but at what they do for themselves. Sometimes we have situations where people project certain fears against us because they don't want certain actions to happen, but in reality, it's quite the opposite. So I'm thinking that what Seth is said is true, and I'll talk about that in segment 3 and a couple of documentaries to really kind of back up his claim. So, like I said, you can watch it on Netflix. It's currently online. I'm not sure which theaters are playing, but it's out there. So if you really want to have a good time and have lots of laughs, this is definitely a movie that I would highly recommend. So I'll talk to you in a bit with segment 3.
Do you ever feel so paper thin, like a house of cards, one blow from caving in? Do you ever feel already buried deep, 6 feet under screams and no one seems to hear a thing? Do you know that there's still a chance for you, 'cause there's a spark in you, but you just got to ignite the light and let it shine.
To quote Sun Tzu, it is said that if you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. Seems very appropriate considering how I knew very little about North Korea until the scandal came out, the fallout from the movie, of the interview, how it led me to read Pyongyang, how it led me to do research about North Korea, and how it became North Korea. How can it be said about many other people, except what they've been told to believe in? There's nothing wrong with, trusting what is being said as being truthful, but there's always two sides to every story. Using another sci-fi reference, and this is something if you are a Walking Dead fan and watch season 5 or haven't, then this is a little bit of a spoiler. There's a place that our survivors go to called Terminus. And the people in Terminus, we thought that this was going to be a safe haven for us, turned out to be basically like a spider web for flies to get attached, and then the Terminus people go ahead and eat the survivors that arrive in Terminus. As we find out, is that what happened to them, the people of Terminus, was that they were never like this. Whatever survivors came before this incident, they were open, they were willing to help out others and share, but these group really messed them up and did the exact same thing as what they're doing now to others. So, through events and interference, people can shape how people become later on. North Korea is no different. We have the Japanese involvement, we have Russia involved, USA involved as well. So all this mix makes us believe, well, they're the enemies and they're, as quote-unquote, batshit crazy. To a degree, yes, but also, we also created that batshit crazy too. Now, the two documentaries that I did watch was on Netflix, one for National Geographic called Inside North Korea, and the other one is PBS Frontline, Secret State of North Korea. The one with National Geographic, Lisa Ling is a journalist who is posing as an eye surgery coordinator, and she's there with a camera crew to kind of document what was happening for this Western doctor who was allowed to perform 1,000 cataracts. Now, what was interesting is that during the time between surgeries, they were allowed to look at the countries and they were able to film secretly what life was like. And it was interesting to see how clean it is, how nice it was, and certain things that we were allowed to see. But the most telling part of what the whole episode of this was that, great, this doctor performed 1,000 cataract removals. Each one, for the most part, when they were able to see and got their sight restored, got up and thanked the pictures of their leaders for giving them this ability to see again, as opposed to thanking the doctor and the team that was behind him to perform the surgery. And that was complete, utter, I don't know, it makes no sense. Because you would think if this is such a great leader, he would have taken care of his people, and this would never have happened in the first place. But the irony is, they still thanked him anyway, because it's so embedded in their heads about their propaganda is so strong in them. You cannot break that, and that's almost mind-boggling to me, to believe that that's what's happening over there. That no matter how bad things are, they're still grateful for their leaders, which makes me believe that whole Terminus thing is on par. So you really can't fault them for that, because that's what they believe. The other one, the PBS Frontline thing, was a little bit hard for me to watch. Basically, Kim Jong-un had talked about how all Korean children are born strong and intelligent, but they're showing a documentary, or they documented children on the outskirts of Pyongyang where they're begging for money and they have no food. And they're living on the streets, and it was really hard to watch because, being that I have 2 kids, as much as they drive me crazy, it's heartbreaking to see kids in that situation. So basically, you're raising kids that are going to have stunted growth, and for a generation, and if not more, you're going to have people who are going to be, I don't want to consider them inferior, but compared to what everyone else is, those who have money and have power have a better lifestyle and better livelihood than these kids do. So it's weird that, again, North Korea is protecting itself from the world, but yet it still neglects the people and the children that they are supposed to protect. Nonetheless, I had to basically fast forward through that segment. The other thing was the Border Patrol. In the 38th parallel, they have this scene play out where 2 North Koreans are facing each other, making sure that either one does not leave its post, with another guard in between them, further up, facing north, making sure no one's coming down to escape into South Korea. And then you have the South Korean border guards standing in these weird, aggressive poses for hours at a time and not moving. So it's like this weird moment of time that's just frozen, and it's weird to watch, but it is what it is, unfortunately. So, who's to blame in this point? Is it the artists? Is it the work? Well, it's not the first time that we had issues where art really makes fun of life. We have Charlie Chaplin, who did The Great Dictator, which poked fun at Hitler. Salman Rushdie in Satanic Verse, talking about the Prophet Muhammad. Martin Scorsese, the director, The Last Temptation of Christ, which was Jesus, and how he had this one moment, decided not to die on the cross, and lived a different life. And not so much Paul Newman in this movie, but the Fort Apache, the Bronx. Ethnic minorities were really upset about their portrayal in this. So, in each of those situations, sure, there are protests, and people bring light to these issues, good or bad. With the interview, it's not so much that I really would have cared to watch this movie in the first place, but because we're told by North Korea, oh, no, you can't watch this. Why? Because we'll kill you, just like we did on 9/11. Not them, but kill you in the likes of 9/11. So I don't like being threatened that way. But on the same point, and Seth brought this up, it's not so much that he made this movie. The threat was that this movie was going to be sneaked into North Korea. And that was going to be put underground, and other people are going to watch it within North Korea. And
that documentary, the PBS Frontline, did show people sneaking in contraband, such as movies and CDs, for people to watch under the cover of darkness, literally. So it would not be surprising that this movie does help fuel some views about their great leader, because that's what I think ultimately is about. It's not so much don't make fun of our leader, it's the fact that he's worried about losing this face, this persona, this build-up about him being, a great leader and being now third in line to this empire that they've created. So they don't want that to go away. Hence why they don't want this movie to be seen. So, to quote an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon can go to China. So when it comes to North Korea, can only Rodman go to North Korea? So I encourage you to check out Pyongyang by Guy Delisle. Of course, check out the interview on Netflix if you like. I encourage that too. And basically, I'm going to be on Twitter. You can find me at page49, but it's going to be page, and then 49 spelled out, FORTYNINE. So you can look for me there, as well as on Facebook. I do have a page 49 fan page. So, in closing, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'm hoping to do more podcasts since it'll be by myself doing the library stuff. I do want to ask for your input, what you thought about it, what you liked, disliked. You can contact me on those social platforms. You can contact me on those social media platforms or at my email, montgomerylopez@live.com. So, next topic I'm looking to do is on James Bond, which may not seem like much, but the take is going to be on what Rush Limbaugh had talked about in light of the Sunday hack, being that James Bond was going to possibly have a black actor. So I'm going to talk about that and use, again, the library as a resource. So, thank you very much for listening to Page 49, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thanks again, everyone. Good night.